And I'd like now to introduce, inshallah, Shaykh Dr. RIdhwan Saleem, and hopefully I'll give a more befitting bio this time. Shaykh RIdhwan began his studies shortly after 1997, was about the time I was fortunate enough to meet Shaykh RIdhwan. And his journeys after he graduated in medicine took him across 2 continents. And most recently, he had spent several years in Syria studying under modern day giants and studying with a wide variety of scholars, including Shaykh Muhammad al-Yaqubi, and where he was given ijaza in a variety of sciences. Also spending time with Alama Shaykh Siraj al-Islam Chaudhry, may Allah protect him, from Liverpool, and Zaid Sheikh Abdul Wahab Najib of Syria. Shaykh RIdhwan is the founding principal of Wlsis and also Lady Nafisa School, and has been involved with the Hounslow community, transmitting the classical knowledge. Even when he came back in the first instance for a short 8-week or 9-week break back in the early noughties, he spent that time inviting students around his house and transmitting what he had acquired.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Hopefully you got the slideshow there. I've added there my qualifications. One of the nice things about doing psychiatry is when you get the professional qualification, you have a very long string of letters after your name, almost longer than your name. It's always difficult to know when introducing oneself. Should you mention your qualifications? Should you say doctor? Because obviously our Islamic etiquette is to be humble and tend not to, advertise ourselves. So I eventually decided to put faqir in front of my name, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Antumul fuqara. All of you are fuqara in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you see, I've got my own psychological issues going on as well. It is, but I guess, as I'm talking about physical and mental health of the child, it probably, you would like to know where my qualifications are in talking about this, especially once you start thinking, what is this crazy guy going on about, as you probably will do soon. Inshallah ta'ala, the subject is huge. We're talking about physical health, mental health of our children. We're bringing up our children in this country. We're living in times where things are very different to previous times. We no longer live like human beings did for many, many centuries or thousands of years in small communities, in villages, in agricultural societies, small towns. We don't have that reality anymore. Everything is completely different since the Industrial Revolution and coming into the modern age, and now coming into a technological and computerized age. Things are very different. Things are quite confusing. People don't really know how to deal with these realities or what sort of effects they're having on our children. How do we bring our children up? Because obviously it's our responsibility as parents primarily to nurture our children, their physical, obviously the spiritual well-being comes first, and that's what Shaykh Akram Nadwi, inshallah ta'ala, who's one of my teachers, will be talking about later. But also we do have a strong obligation to look after their physical well-being and their mental well-being. So as it's a huge topic, I will touch on some principles or give you some basic ideas, some of which you may already know, some maybe things may be new to you, just to hopefully give you some of the real foundational principles that can guide us through then traversing this new age that we find ourselves in. First of all, I'd like to just mention about a sort of a fundamental difference between the Western scientific worldview or the Western scientific way of looking at things and the Quranic or Islamic worldview or principles, particularly with regard to our physical and mental well-being. So this slide, you'll see a picture of a famous guy called Charles Darwin. who came up with this theory, evolution theory. And I would suggest that this theory has got massive repercussions throughout our ways of thinking, and especially amongst Western societies, but this may have influenced us in ways that we haven't realized ourselves sometimes. I know people recently, some people may have been talking about a Muslim or an Islamic, that evolution theory is compatible with Islam, etc. I don't want to go into that discussion right now, except to say that if you say there was an evolution, that human being was created through an evolutionary process, but that was guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, that is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose to create the human being, then that is not evolution theory. That is not Darwin's theory of evolution. That is a new concept which may or may not be right, and I don't think it's an issue or a problem, and it's an interesting thing to look into. But evolution theory, as understood in the West, is a different concept, because it's all based on chance and random events, random mutations, survival of the fittest. It takes God out of the equation, and that's the whole point of it. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why it has become so prominent is because there's no other theory to explain how creation came about or how human beings came about. So the only alternative, if you don't fall back on that, then you have to come to a conclusion of a divine intervention. So some of the repercussions from evolution theory, if I could just read my notes, which I can't. Some of the ideas that come through that may have influenced us without us knowing it. So evolution theory believes that, you know, life evolves through this random mutation, survival of the fittest. This idea that this life is a constant struggle, it's a constant battle against our environment, and only the strongest will survive to the next generation. Only the strongest will survive to pass their genes on to the next generation. And this has had huge repercussions throughout the 20th century. A lot of repercussions in things that we, or Western civilizations, tries to erase from our memories, like eugenics movements and, you know, killing people who were disabled or who had mental illness because their genes are faulty. A lot of it was used as justification for colonialization, because African people or those people are less, you know, less developed or evolved than we white people are, etc. The Quran teaches us something completely different to this idea of human being. And the Quran is really teaching us that the human being has been created in a perfect form. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the heavens and the earth and subjugated them to the human being. So in other words, all of creation has been created in service of the human being. So it's very different to the idea of a constant battle and a constant struggle. And I'm going to just give you some ayahs of Quran to just illustrate my point here. So if we move on to the next slide. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم لقد خلقنا الإنسان في أحسن تقويم. We created man in the best stature. في أحسن تقويم. Now here, taqweem is to do with balance and form. You know, the human being is in a perfect balance, a perfect form. And ahsan is superlative, which means that you can't get better than ahsan. Ahsan means the best form. You cannot improve on something which is already ahsan. So the whole idea of evolution, if we accept Darwinian evolution theory, in maybe in a million years' time, human beings could have 4 arms. Surely 4 arms will be better than 2, because you can, you know. So it's evolution. You're always adapting. So if someone was born with 3 arms, you know, evolution would favor him in terms of procreation, etc. But no. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says He created us in the best stature. So you can't improve on the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And through the lecture, inshallah, we're going to give more examples of how the Western scientific worldview leads us to always try to think we can improve on things. And we can always change things and improve on them. And a lot of that is driven by the bottom line, which is common throughout this culture now, which is about making money. Next slide, please. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ لَكُمْ مَا فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا. He it is who created for you all that is in the earth. He created for you, lakum meaning human beings. All that is in the earth. So everything that is on the earth is created for us, in our service. The human being is the Khalifa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this creation. You know? Next slide, please. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Alam taraw anna Allah sakhara lakum ma fi samawati wa ma fi al-ard wa asbagha alaykum ni'amahu zahiratan wa batina. Have you not seen how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has subjugated for you all that is in the heavens and the earth? All that is in the heavens and the earth, the sun, the moon. The sun is there to give us heat, to give us life in our plants, in our vegetation. The moon is there to show us the counting of the months. The stars are there to beautify the heaven for us and to guide us when we are on our journeys in the sea and on the land. The whole of creation has been subjugated, has been made subservient to the human being. So if we go on to the next slide, just to summarize what we've said so far, we can say that the Western scientific view of things is that man can improve on nature. Man can improve on nature. Scientists, those guys that are out there with their white lab coats and doing experiments, cruel experiments on animals, they're going to give us things that are going to make our life better. They're going to improve on things. We have to pay for that, of course. But what Islam is telling us and what the Quran is telling us is nature is best. Or natural is best. Because when we say nature, don't forget, when you say nature, we mean what is created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, this makes it probably easier for us to understand when we say those things which are natural are best for the human being. Because I'm sure this is quite a common view. And a lot of non-Muslims also arrive to these conclusions without having recourse to the Quran. So you find massive numbers of non-Muslims in this culture that believe in natural products, to believe that you should be more connected to nature. So as Muslims, we should have brought this message to people. But in fact, they're bringing that back to us. Because in many Muslim countries, our intelligentsia in Muslim countries are nothing more than people who are just infatuated with the West. They imitate the West. They think if we imitate the West, we're going to get progress. The Muslim physicians, they saw disease or illness as an imbalance. So an imbalance of the body's natural state. And this could come about through various ways, which we, inshallah ta'ala, will be looking at in more detail. And this also includes mental illness. So physical and mental illness, interestingly for Muslim scholars in the past, were very similar entities actually. And I think a lot of people may not be aware of this because there is a very common perception amongst Muslims that mental illness is due to possession by jinn or black magic and type things like that. If you study back to the medieval Islamic physicians, when Islam was at the height of its culture and learning, and we look back and see how did these Muslim physicians, great physicians like Ibn Sina and others, how did they treat mental illness? In fact, we'll find that it was treated as a physical illness, an illness of the brain, an imbalance in the body's humors that leads to an imbalance in the brain. Now, of course, there is such a thing as black magic because that is mentioned in the Quran. يُفَرِّقُونَ بِهِ بَيْنَ الْمَرْءِ وَزَوْجِهِ. As I mentioned in the Quran, that this can be used by people, this type of black magic, to separate between man and wife, is the example given in the Quran. So I'm not, of course, denying that that is not the case. That is the case. But what I'm saying is there is a tendency amongst Muslims to attribute everything to jinns or evil spirits. If we go to the next slide. In fact, if you look historically, this was much more a feature of Christian tradition. Because Christianity has within it clearly in the Bible, they have Jesus casting out spirits from people who were insane. Now we don't really have anything of that comparable nature. Maybe Shaykh Akram can, I know I spoke to him before about this, and you mentioned that we don't really have anything in our tradition from our sunnah, if you look at the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, of that type of thing taking place. Correct me if I'm wrong, Shaykh. So it's generally useful to have a hadith expert in the house, so you can clarify things. So, you know, the Prophet ﷺ, we don't know of him doing that. Or, you know, I have not come across stories of Sahaba performing exorcism. So the Christian tradition, they had this, though, it's in the Bible. And Muslims were quite influenced by that as well, because a lot of the Christian lands were taken over by Muslims in Sham and Egypt, etc. So a lot of, so for I'll refer you to a book. If you go to the next slide, I'll refer you to a book, a really good book written on the subject of how mental illness was understood and treated in the medieval Islamic world. And this was a time when Islam, you know, Islamic learning was at its height. So it's written by a man called Dolls, who's a professor in Oxford, was a professor in Oxford. Not a Muslim actually, but a very detailed and excellent study on this subject. It's called Majnoon, the Madman in the Medieval Islamic History. Very hard book to get hold of. I could only find 2 copies in the whole of London. One was in the SOAS library and one was in the British Library. You can't buy it, you know, I searched online in bookshops, so it's quite a rare book to get hold of, but very valuable for people who are interested in this particular thing, because in there he gives a beautiful picture of how we used to have these hospitals around the Muslim world. So the Muslims were the pioneers of hospitals, you know. In every Muslim major city around the Muslim world, and if you read Ibn Battuta and people like that, you'll see also their descriptions. They would have a huge hospital, and the hospitals were always free entry to everyone. And they were often supported by the prince or the king or the sultan or, you know, rich donators. And these hospitals would, a prince could walk in or a poor person, and they would, you know, even princes would go in there because of the excellent standard of hygiene, cleanliness, care that was provided in these hospitals. And the interesting thing relevant to our discussion here is they always had a wing which was for mental illness as well, for people who were mentally ill. So the Muslim physicians, they believed that mental illness was a physical a problem of the brain. They had inherited this knowledge from the ancient Greek tradition through Hippocrates, etc., and through primarily through the translations of the works of Galen. And the Muslim physicians, they often mention when they talk about mental illness that, you know, a lot of the common people, they think is due to possession by evil spirits or jinns. So even at that time, yes, it was amongst people, common people, this type of perception. But they said we are physicians, so we don't, you know, we don't really go into that type of things. We treat people's illnesses. Okay. Now, as I said before, I'm not negating that there are such things. Obviously, there are things as jinns, and whether they can or not possess people, that's a different discussion, which I don't have expertise in. But just to raise that awareness that mental illness is often a physical illness. You know, it could be something you're born with that then comes on later on because you've got some illness in the brain. It could come through injuries to the head. It can come through many different ways. If we go to the next slide, so the causes of physical and mental illness. So we can treat them both together, physical and mental illness, because both are essentially there's something is gone out of balance within the body. And this can happen through various means that we'll talk about. So if we say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us perfect, in a perfect balance, in a perfect harmony with our environment, the natural environment, how can things go wrong with this, with our body, with our physical and mental state? There's not many ways that we can affect our balance. One is through what we take into our mouth, and the other is what we inhale into our lungs. They're the two main passages of entry into the human body. Okay, so if we take in the wrong things into our mouth, we may lead to imbalances, we may lead to illness and disease. If we are inhaling noxious or poisonous chemicals, that is also going into our body, that can also lead to imbalance and disease. So these are the type of things that are going into the body. Then you also have, particularly with mental illness, you have what we call life events, stressful life events. These are things like, obviously, someone has a bereavement, someone dies in the family, or they have a very traumatic experience and they have a breakdown. They could go into a depressive breakdown, or they could go into more of a what we call schizophrenic breakdown, which is a more type of the classical type of madness that you would expect. But both are due to extremely stressful events. There may be a genetic component to that. So, in other words, the best way to look at it is like a house. If you look at the houses, the way the house is built, the material that is used, how strong the foundations are, all of that is your genetic inheritance. Because people are born different. We have different personalities. Some of us have more personalities that are able to withstand much more pressure, much more stress, much more shocks. Some of us are more fragile. So that's what you're born with, and you can't really do anything about that. So that's the building. But then you have the tornadoes and the storms which come, and these are the life events. So if you already have a weak building, then it might take much less to knock you over. But if you have a strong building, it will take you much more to knock you over. And when the house comes tumbling down, that means you've had your breakdown. And that's probably the best, easiest way to conceptualize the whole idea. A lot of doctors will probably confuse you when you ask them about things, and they'll tell you, oh, it's genetic, or it's this and that, because they confuse themselves. Or they probably have more mental illness than you do. The highest suicide rates are in doctors, of all people. But then again, they say that's because they have easy access to the drugs and the means of committing suicide, which is probably true. And they know how to make it painless as possible, because it's actually very painful. It's very difficult to end your life if you wanted to. I'm not suggesting anyone should, obviously, especially not in the way of suicide bombing or anything like that. But it is difficult to end your life. As working as a psychiatrist, you do get a lot of very depressed people, and they get even more depressed because they try to kill themselves, but they fail. It is not easy. I mean, think about if you want to jump in front of a train, you know, it's quite scary. Or stab yourself, it's very painful. So they often don't succeed. If we go to the next slide. So when man lives in balance and harmony with his environment, there's going to be less illness. Now, we're not saying there's no such thing as illness if you just lived in a perfect balanced life. It doesn't mean there's no illness. There are illnesses, of course. But you'll be much able to recover from them when you get them, and you'll be much less susceptible to illness. And illness is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to test people and to give them reward when they have sabr. So we're not saying there's no illness, but it's how to best be as physically and mentally fit as possible. So we see that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was a physician that was sent to Medina by a non-Muslim king as a gift to the Prophet ﷺ. And this physician came and he spent a certain amount of time in Medina, I believe 1 year. And after a year he said, I'm leaving. There's no point me staying here because you people don't need me. Because the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ, they were in this real state of, you know, the perfect type of balance with the environment and the way they were living. Because the other aspect I haven't mentioned is the spiritual aspect as well. Because if the spiritual aspect is in balance and in harmony and in dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, That is the strongest type of balance that we require as well. So they were in a physical, mental and spiritual balance with their environment. If you look at the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, and once again I'll ask Shaykh Akram if he knows of any incident, but I can't think of any incident in which the Prophet ﷺ was actually having a illness or a disease. Apart from his final, when he was in his final illness, and there was a time when he had actually black magic done on him by some Jewish people, but to have any other illness or disease, I haven't personally come across in the seerah. And when the Prophet ﷺ had a few grey hairs towards the end of his life, because he died at the age of 63, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had a few grey hairs. And Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he saw him, and when he saw the grey hairs, he said to him, Shibta ya Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said in sort of surprise, "Oh Messenger of Allah, you've got some grey hairs." And the interesting thing there was, Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was 2 years younger than the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but he had far more number of grey hairs already. But he was surprised, he mentioned this to the Prophet ﷺ because it wasn't really expected. Because the Prophet ﷺ was in such a perfect harmony and such a perfect balance with the food that he was taking in, the environment that they were living in, the natural surroundings and the spiritual balance that he was in. It wasn't expected. This is one of the things we heard from one of our Shaykhs, Shaykh al-Yaqubi. And he said, Shayyabatni Hud wa akhawatuha. He says, Surat al-Hud and its sisters have made me go grey. Surat al-Hud, the chapter of the Quran, Hud, and those that come with it, they are the weight of the revelation had made some grey hairs on him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if we go to the next slide, just to reiterate that, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the best of creation. He is the perfect pinnacle of all human beings. He is the Khalifa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon this earth. So if we study the way he lived, his physical, mental and spiritual state, how he was eating, what sort of environment he was in, then that will help us also to live in that perfect balance. So we see the Prophet ﷺ, he used natural soaps. He used a natural toothbrush, the miswak. So don't forget, when we say natural, we say created. It means actually created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created these things for us to use. But what Western science is telling you, no. We can give you something better. We can go in our laboratories, we'll do some experiments, we'll bring you soap that will clean you much, much better than the soap that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made for you. But they won't say that, they'll say natural products, who uses that? That's backward. Yeah, that's backward. We can give you toothpaste that's much better now. It's got fluoride in it which will kill germs. Then later on they find out, but actually it kills germs that are good for you as well. But we won't tell people that too much. Okay. So if we had a deep and profound understanding of our deen, we don't need to wait for them to find out that actually fluoride is maybe not that good for you. Maybe it's killing germs that are harmful for you. We should have known from the beginning, the thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, you can't improve on the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet ﷺ lived in moderation. So moderation in your diet is a key sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And this is not because they had less money or less access to food like we do. Because even in the time of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, when all of the wealth of Persia and all of the riches of the world were opened up to the Muslims, Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu was still living in the same way. He was living with 2 items of clothing that he would wear. And he made it forbidden in Medina that you should eat meat 2 days in a row. Because people were becoming so wealthy, they had access to that type of thing then. If we go to the next slide, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakallah khair. So this, just to summarize now, these are the 6 aspects that will affect us or can affect us in a negative way and put us out of balance, physically or mentally. The 5 things actually. The 5 things are the physical and mental exercise is something that we need. I'll talk about later. Moderate diet is from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. A clean environment, so to have clean water, clean sewage, etc. Natural products, the things we put into our mouths, into our bodies, to make sure they're natural products, not artificial. And the social, what I'm calling the social and cultural environment. And inshallah ta'ala, we're going to look at all of these in a bit more detail to wind up. All of these are things that can affect us, affect our physical and mental health. If we go to the next slide, the best treatment is preventative. By the time we get the illness, the damage is already done. This is especially true of mental illness. So most of psychiatry is damage limitation. Once someone has had a breakdown, or they've gone into a depression or whatever they've gone into, you're going to try the best to improve their quality of life or improve their state. But rarely going to fix that, because it's something that's arisen through years and years and years of things that have affected them. And why this is important today is obviously because we're trying to learn how to bring our children up and how to protect them from all of these problems. Most physical illnesses as well are damage limitation. So what are the biggest, things? We have heart disease. Once you've got heart disease, you're not going to get rid of it. Now, the damage has been done over years and years and years of bad lifestyle, eating the wrong type of things. We've got a cardiothoracic surgeon here, please. So please, Dr. Kamran, let us know if so you're going to have people like Dr. Kamran here just doing plumbing jobs on you, fixing your arteries so you can get your heart, But, by that time, his damage has been done over many, many years. So even physicians and, doctors will tell you, you have to try to prevent this from taking place. And so they are, catching on to all of these things. Diabetes, cancers. Now, there's no cure for these things. They're things that have come through years and years of bad trauma to our physical bodies. If you go to the next slide. So inshallah, we'll just look at these 6 aspects in a bit more detail. The first one I mentioned was physical and mental exercise. Most people are probably aware of the importance now of physical exercise in terms of our general health. So for our children, we have to make sure they do have regular physical exercise, because we're living in an environment that's not conducive to that. We're living in cities and towns. People are no longer letting their children out of their houses. When we were young 20 years ago, children used to run around the streets, and they used to be all the time outside playing cricket or football on the roads, riding bikes around. People no longer letting out their children out of their houses. Look around the streets. How many children do you see playing around? My children don't go out because no one else is sending their children out. And it's partly because of a fear of what society has become, what type of people are out there. A lot of scaremongering amongst the media, blowing up stories about children that get abducted, etc., which just blows it all out of proportion. But who knows, maybe the problem is getting worse. With the introduction of the internet, and people who have sick thoughts like pedophilic thoughts are able to now channel those energies through the internet and find other people that they can link up with, which wasn't the case before the internet came about. Someone who had these sick type of ideas or thoughts, they would just suppress them or forget about them or try to just ignore them because the society wouldn't be conducive to it. So in this situation, we have to make sure our children are getting physical exercise. And a really good, another good book on depression, severe depression, called The Anatomy of Melancholy, was written by a Christian monk a couple of centuries ago. He was towards the end of the medieval period. And basically he wrote this book. It's all about severe depression. And he summed up in the book all of the traditional knowledge that he had. He was a man of learning, a man of study. He had taken from the Greek tradition and other traditions. So he summed up all the whole traditional wisdom that was discarded by the introduction of modern medicine. So all traditional herbal medicine, all of that was just thrown out of the window and called quackery. And now we have new scientific medicine come in. Interestingly enough, the first medical school, the first modern medical school opened up in New York was by one of the Rockefeller family, Jewish oil banking family. So in this book, he mentions the real importance of physical and mental exercise. What this means is that as human beings, we're created, our bodies were created to work. You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created our physical bodies to work. And He's created our brains to be used. And if we don't use them, this was one of the major causes of falling into a severe depressive state. So people who sit around all the time, they're not using their physical, you know, they're not exerting themselves physically. This can lead to falling into a depressive type of state. People who are just mentally inactive, so they don't have anything to occupy them, they're mentally, you know, study or things like that. This can lead to then the mind, just you're sitting around all the time, they're thinking about aimless things, the mind is wandering, and then the mind turns in on itself and starts attacking itself. And you end up in a breakdown or a severe depression or something like that. This is a real problem, a real social problem amongst our communities. The whole thing about mental illness amongst our communities is all stigmatized and all hidden under the carpet. I mean, probably there's no one here who doesn't know people who are suffering from severe mental illness in their own families, but we don't bring that out into public, we don't talk about it. Amongst our communities, we tend to just keep it within the family, which is fine and good. But it's a real issues, because obviously these issues do come to me, and I see them. Modern society, the type of world we're living in, is causing mental illness. It's causing people to break down. It's causing people to go neurotic. So to keep ourselves occupied physically, mentally, make sure you have regular physical exercise once or twice a week at least. I think your doctor guys will say 5 days a week now, at least half an hour. But for our children, you know, make sure that the schools have got physical activities. Make sure you take them out to parks and make them run around. Don't go to the park, sit down and have a picnic, eat your parathas and kebabs and everything and go back home like we used to do in the traditional times. Because we need to get the kids exercising and running around, okay? It's always a funny thing we mention about Pakistani families when they go to any outing or trip. The first thing we do, we get out the car, we put the picnic down. Pull out the food straight away. Next slide, please. Yeah, and keeping mentally occupied. So this is what we're seeing a lot now amongst our older generation, especially our mother's generation. Asian ladies whose whole lives have been revolving around the family, bringing up the children. As the children leave the house, our mothers, our aunties are left with nothing, and now their children have all left. They have nothing to fall back on. When you're old, when you're 60 or 55 or 60 or 65, it's very difficult to start learning new things, because as we get older, we can become more rigid in our ways of thinking, in our habits. It's very difficult for older people to start new things and start, you know, say to them, go and start studying Islam or go and, you know, do this or that, because by that time they're already set in their habits the way they've been all that time. And it's very rare to find older people that are able to, you know, embark on new things. But it's not unheard of, but it's not the norm. So our aunties, our mothers, they're now then falling into depression, having breakdowns, because now their mind they have got nothing to occupy themselves. So it's very important, two aspects there. Firstly, we have to take care of our mothers and our aunts and our people, because we're not people who just abandon. You don't abandon your own parents. This is like the foundational aspect of our deen. I get a bit upset because I see so many cases of this, because people come to me, because I am in psychiatry. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives tawfiq. You know, birrul walidain, etc., to take care of parents is one of the central concepts. So we need to take care of that. Also, sisters who are mothers, etc., they should realize, you know, when your children are going to move on, you need to have things that you're going to go back to. So don't, you know, because your meaning of life is not just to bring up your children. Your meaning of life is to become worshippers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to be engaged in dhikr and study of Quran or any of these type of things is something that sisters should be engaged in, even if they have families and so on. So they'll be able to go back to that and devote their life to ibadat, etc. If you're someone who's devoted to dhikr and ibadah in your early age, in your youth, then you will continue that when you get older, and you'll find the pleasure and the beauty of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you'll be happy to sit and do dhikr and remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if you're not someone who's done that when they were younger, it's very difficult actually to start that when you're older. If you go to, I think we're on the next slide, which is on the moderate diet. I think I'll just pass this one by. I think I probably said enough, and plus I don't like to preach what I don't practice, so I'm a bit self-conscious here on this one. But self-explanatory, okay? You know, your doctors will tell you that. The next one, clean environment, water, sewage. Many people have a false impression that Western society, you know, obviously they do have much higher indices of health than we have in Eastern countries. They have much better child mortality rates. Their children survive much more. And a lot of people have this misconception that this is due to advances in medicine, advances in, for example, immunizations, etc. The real true fact is, and if you study public health or look up any textbooks about public health, most of these advances have been made through simple clean water and good sewage. That is the vast majority of the improvements in health that have been made in Western countries. And this is what we need in Eastern countries. Just simple, clean water for people to drink and good sewage facilities to protect our health. Because this is where a lot of disease is coming in Eastern countries. So that's something for you to just look into more yourselves. Look up a textbook in public health and look at that. And you'll find that what I'm saying is correct. Next slide. I'm getting a lot of messages there going down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So next one is natural products, right? So it's all about avoiding artificial additives in our food. We don't know what the effects of them are. You know, don't just think because they're in all the food, artificial additives, that they're safe, because we don't know that. And lots of studies, you know, do internet searches, you'll find lots of things about artificial additives. In Western countries, non-Muslims are very strong on using natural products because these things can be harmful, and Muslims are woefully backward on this issue. And this, you know, what I'm saying is, if we understand those concepts about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created things for us, we want to take the things that He created into our bodies, not the things that scientists are artificially engineering for you. So even if you have to pay a bit extra, get the stuff that says no artificial additives, all natural products, and give that to our children, because our children are more susceptible than we are. Children are developing at a very rapid rate. Their neurological system, their brain is developing very rapidly. And the younger they are, the more susceptible they are to things going wrong. It's like if you fire an arrow, you know, the further it goes towards the target, it won't deviate very much. But if it deviates from here, even if you deviate a little bit, it will go very far off the target. So if you do a little bit of damage to a young child, it will have a massive impact as they grow, because their brain is still developing, it's growing. So be really careful with our children, more careful than we are with ourselves. So just you know, really careful what we give them to eat or drink. Once again, I'm not a perfect example. I live also within the society, is difficult, but we must try our best. And I would say at least when children are 1, 2, 3, 4 years old, you know, really try to give them nothing artificial. And it's a struggle for me as well. You know, I'm always trying to stop my children from eating certain type of crisps or things. But if they want to eat crisps, there are natural, you know, there are natural ones like kettle chips or things that I say all natural ingredients. So just think about that, because that is a big issue. And that's a big cause of, we don't know what type of illnesses they're causing in people as they get older. You know, many of the illnesses that we have now when we get 40, 50 may well be due to things that we've been eating when we were children and growing up. It's practically impossible to study the effects of these artificial additives now, because to do a study you have to compare against people who take them and people who don't take them. And because they're everywhere, it's hard to find people that don't take these things. So, I'm sorry, I could do we could do a talk on each different thing, but we need to move on. So if you just go to the next slide. Is there a picture of a cow up there? Oh, good. It's the right slide. Because I've talked a lot theoretical, I just want to give two hard examples just to illustrate the point, and hopefully people will then be able to just extend that and use that in other things. We're talking about milk. Now, milk is something that we all drink. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, وَإِنَّ لَكُمْ فِي الْأَنْعَامِ لَعِبْرَةً نُسْقِيكُم مِّمَّا فِي بُطُونِهِ مِن بَيْنِ فَرْثٍ وَدَمٍ لَبَنًا خَالِصًا سَائِغًا لِلشَّارِبِينَ. So it's a very beautiful and strong statement in the Quran. It said, in the cattle there is a lesson for you. We give you to drink of what is in their bellies. We give you to drink, nusqikum, literally, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving you this to drink. What is in their bellies? From between the intestine and the blood. A pure milk, palatable. And he even says, labanan khalisan, a pure milk. How much more proof do we need than this just ayah of Quran, that this milk, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us something. This is for us, for our health, nutrition. If we go to the next slide, we'll see in the 20th century, mid-20th century, scientists started saying, no, we can improve this milk. Okay? We need to pasteurize it. We need to boil it up. We need to kill all the germs. What they didn't tell you and what they found now is those germs or those things that were in the milk were not in the milk itself. They were due to the dirty conditions of the farms and the dirty conditions of the farmers, not to do with the milk itself. But anyway, that's a different story. The point here, they said, we're going to improve it, we're going to pasteurize it, we're going to homogenize it. So now all of us, we drink pasteurized milk. Now, why? As you can probably not read on that slide because the text is too small, but right at the bottom point says, several studies done in the University of London recently, they got children and they gave them just 1 glass of raw milk twice a week. So 2 times a week they were given 1 glass of raw milk to the children. They found dramatic results in rates of eczema and other allergies, reduced by between 1/3 to half in those children, just from drinking 1 glass of raw milk twice a week. And more evidence is coming up. Once again, you can search for it yourselves and you'll find this. Now, as Muslims, the point here is we should have already had an alarm bell ringing. When scientists start saying to us, we're going to give you something better than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made for you, we should have had some alarm bells ringing and we should have said, no, actually, this is what the Prophet ﷺ was drinking. And he was a man in a perfect balance and in a perfect health. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created for us to drink. Next slide, please. The next example is infant formula milk. If you remember back to the 80s, 70s, scientists started saying, forget about breastfeeding. We are going to give you something much better. We are going to give you formula milk. And I know some people are laughing because they remember that because we were their children and they were giving us bottle milk. Yeah? So our parents' generation were the ones who went through this, and it was such a big, massive movement and propaganda. Obviously, some multinational companies made billions of pounds at the same time, which is the other aspect that I'm not going to touch upon, but it's all about making money, most of these things. But it was actually got to the point where if you were giving your child breast milk, you were made to feel very backward in Western culture, in the Western culture. And if you go to the next slide, it was literally just the poor women or really backward people that would be breastfeeding children, and everyone had to bottle feed. Because they said, look, scientists were putting extra nutrients in there, we're putting extra vitamins in there, you can't breastfeed anymore. So you see how the idea of evolution comes in everywhere, it permeates everywhere. We're able to improve things, you see. So many babies, probably like myself, I need to ask, but it was during our time when we were young, they were bottle fed. If we go to the next slide, as you know now, the whole thing changed. Coming into the 90s, doctors started telling us, actually, no, you go back to breastfeeding, okay? Because science had then found out all the negative effects of bottle feeding. If you go to GP surgeries now, you'll probably see their breast is best or something like that. Yeah? Go back to the next slide, please. The most prestigious journal in the medical profession is called The Lancet. They published a series of articles called the Child Survival Series. This is a very important series of articles to do with children's health in poorer countries, and is considered the gold standard of studies that have been conducted in this area. They estimated that the best intervention they could do to save lives of babies in poorer countries was to introduce back breastfeeding. This would save on approximately 1.3 million children every year, and it was more effective than giving them safe water, sanitation, or vaccination. Why? Because in our countries, in Eastern countries, people are still being given formula milk because they don't have the legal protection, the system to protect multinational companies from aggressively marketing their products, even though they know that this is detrimental to the children's health. So go to the next slide. Then we'll go to the next slide, inshallah. Just thinking how I can just wind this up now. There's just 2 points left. So I think if we just summarize, this one was about the, is this about the social and cultural environment? Now this is a big topic. I gave a talk about this in Hounslow Masjid recently, specifically focusing on our social and cultural environment that we find ourselves in, specifically television, internet, the visual media. And I would refer you to that video is available on our website. If you go to www.wlsis.org, WLSSIS.org, and go to multimedia, please take time to watch that, because I did go a lot into the effects of television, internet, and other visual media upon our mental health and upon our children's mental health, and how it's affecting them, which we don't have time to go into today. The other aspect of social environment is social isolation, because we have had a breakdown of communities, we've had a breakdown of neighborhoods, people don't know, people don't live in communities anymore, and social isolation is becoming a major cause of depression, mental breakdowns, etc. So here we have to think as a community as well, how are we going to face this challenge? We can't just put it under the carpet. We already talked about the mothers, the mother-in-laws, the aunties, people who are becoming isolated. This is not the norm. In traditional societies, people lived in neighborhoods, everyone knew each other. Even if someone lived alone, they would have lots of neighbors, they'd have lots of people visiting all the time, a lot of interaction with everyone. Now that's not the case. People don't know their neighbors. So if you leave someone by themselves, they may become very isolated, especially if they become elderly, they can't travel. And this is also something for our children, because I've seen several cases of we have to think, where are we putting our children? If you put your child in a school where there's no other Muslim children, or there's no other Asian children, what effect is it going to have on that child's mental health? We have to think about this, because I've seen 3 cases personally of, just recently there was one girl, they lived in Reading, it's a predominantly white area, Muslim family. They sent their child to a school. In primary school she was fine. When she went to secondary school, she started getting bullied, she was isolated, she had a complete breakdown. She started hearing voices, started acting strange, screaming, shouting all the time. And that was, something that should have been prevented, really. I mean, you can't blame people, because everyone's trying their best for their own children. So it's not about that, but it's just about how we can learn and try to improve the situation. So if go to the next slide. Unfortunately, don't have time to go into, but a very important aspect is this aspect of social. We're people of jama'ah, we're people of coming together in the masjids, on the Friday prayers, etc. And we're relational people. We're not like in the West, everyone's an individual. You have to be an individual. Nowadays, people don't even care about their own wives or children or parents or anything. It's just an individual. You live by yourself, you do your own thing. Islam, we're defined by our relationships to other people. So inshallah, maybe on another occasion we should talk about that in more depth. So if we go to the next slide. This was about the television, internet. The website is there that you can look at for more information. And the next slide is draws us to the close. So there are those 5 aspects. Hopefully, we went through some of them in some detail, but we didn't get time to delve into the last couple. Inshallah ta'ala, maybe on another occasion. Thank you very much. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all tawfiq. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وآله سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين الحمد لله رب العالمين.